Thank you to everyone who's joined us on this journey through the ancient world. If you enjoy what we do, we would love if you subscribed. Every listener helps us keep bringing the past to life with facts, not fiction. In this audio documentary, we explore a side of ancient Rome that few people think about. Not its legions or its monuments, but its greatest weakness. Fire. Rome burned often, sometimes quietly, sometimes catastrophically. From straw-roofed huts to towering wooden apartment blocks, the eternal city was built to catch fire. But it didn't just burn, it fought back. With innovation, with law, and with engineering. This is the story of how Rome battled the flames, from the earliest days of tribal hearths to the creation of a public fire brigade, from the Great Fire under Nero to the water systems that kept disaster at bay. It's a story of destruction, adaptation, and survival. And don't forget our Roman engineering series, also on our YouTube page. There, you'll find All Roads Lead to Rome, the aqueducts that built an empire, the concrete that changed the world, and the empire's metal. Now, let's begin the story of how Rome tried to become fireproof. Chapter 1. When Rome was wood. Before Rome became a city of marble, it was a city of timber, straw, and clay. In its earliest days, Rome was not much more than a scattered village, built on 7 hills overlooking the Tiber River. The first homes were simple huts made from wattle and daub, with thatched roofs and wooden beams. Easy to build, but even easier to burn. Fire was essential to survival. It cooked food, provided warmth, and lit the dark. But in a city made almost entirely of flammable materials, fire was also a constant danger. Open flames flickered in every household. Ashes were thrown carelessly. Embers could slip from clay stoves, unnoticed, until the roof above was already catching. These early homes stood close together, especially in the low-lying areas near the river where working-class Romans settled. Narrow lanes separated one dwelling from another, with barely enough space for 2 people to pass. In dry seasons, all it took was a single spark to ignite a chain of destruction. There were no firebreaks, no stone walls, and no organized response. Archaeologists today have uncovered layers of ash and scorched earth beneath the Roman Forum. These are the silent remains of fires that consumed early Rome. Entire neighborhoods were likely destroyed and rebuilt again and again. But rebuilding did not mean improving. The same vulnerable designs were used each time, with little thought of prevention. Even in legend, fire marks the beginning. According to Rome's founding myth, Romulus lit a sacred flame on the Palatine Hill. From the very first moment, fire was seen as powerful, divine, and dangerous. What's most striking is how little the Romans did to address it. There were no firefighting tools, no public water networks, no warnings. Fires were treated as fate. Something to endure, not something to prevent. The Roman mindset in these early centuries was practical but reactive. Disasters were part of life. The city grew in fits and starts, recovering from destruction without truly learning from it. To the Romans of that age, fire was no different than flood or famine. It came, it passed, and life continued. But fire didn't just destroy homes. It destroyed records, tools, livestock, grain, and sometimes entire family lineages. Losses could be total. And still, the infrastructure remained unchanged. There was no written law, no dedicated magistrate for public safety, and no strategic storage of water beyond a few scattered wells and cisterns. What Rome needed, it didn't yet realize. The danger was hiding in plain sight. By the 3rd century before our era, Rome had become a booming urban centre. The small huts of old had given way to large insulae, apartment buildings that housed much of the city's population. But while the city expanded outward and upward, its fire risk multiplied. The upper classes lived in domus made of stone and tile. but the poor crowded into wooden structures that often rose 4 or 5 stories high. These insulae were cheaply built and dangerously unstable. Walls were thin, floors creaked, and because land was expensive, the buildings were packed tight, sometimes leaning into each other across the alleys. Each of these apartments had lamps, stoves, and brazier fires. Bread ovens ran hot all day. Shopkeepers boiled dyes and oils in rooms below living quarters. A single overturned lamp could destroy an entire block. There was no organized fire service. When flames broke out, the only hope was for neighbors to form a line from the nearest well, passing buckets hand to hand. Some wealthier citizens employed slaves to handle emergencies, sending them with soaked blankets or sand. But for most, there was nothing to do but flee and pray. Fires spread quickly through entire districts, especially in poor neighborhoods where overcrowding was extreme. Entire families could be trapped with no time to escape. Smoke inhalation, structural collapse, and the rapid advance of flames often meant death came in minutes. The Senate occasionally discussed fire hazards, but action was slow. Building codes were vague, and penalties for violations were light. Profits came first. Landlords continued to build higher, even when buildings became unsafe. Safety had no place in the economy of a growing empire. Some citizens took matters into their own hands. Wealthy neighborhoods might pay for watchmen to patrol at night. Traders might keep a barrel of water by their door. But these efforts were piecemeal and uncoordinated. Rome still lacked a city-wide system, and the government, still a republic, placed the burden of safety on private citizens rather than public institutions. Even with their unmatched engineering in roads, bridges, and sewers, the Romans had not yet turned that brilliance toward preventing fire. The threat had grown with the city, and one day soon it would explode in a way no one could ignore. Chapter 2. Sparks in the Republic. By the late Republic, Rome was a city of over 1 million people, spread across hills, valleys, and marketplaces that buzzed from dawn until dusk. The buildings grew taller, the alleys narrower. The city bustled with life, but also with danger. Rome had become a fire trap. Insulae, the sprawling apartment blocks where most Romans lived, were now rising 5 or 6 stories high. They leaned into streets barely wide enough for a cart. At ground level, shops and workshops operated with open flames. Blacksmiths, bakers, candle makers, all squeezed tightly beneath residential floors built mostly of timber. Cooking fires, oil lamps, incense burners, and charcoal braziers burned throughout the day and night. Many insulae were poorly constructed by profit-hungry developers who cared more about rent than safety. Some collapsed under their own weight. Others ignited with terrifying speed. Upper floors were the most vulnerable and hardest to reach. If fire broke out in the middle of the night, escape was almost impossible. Despite the frequency of fires, the Republic did not establish a public firefighting system. Instead, it relied on ad hoc efforts. Wealthy men sometimes funded their own firefighting slaves, a sign of status as much as safety. These private teams would try to extinguish fires near their master's property, and sometimes charge desperate neighbors for help. Fire protection was a luxury. Wells were few and far between, and water had to be carried by hand in buckets made from leather or clay. There were no standardized tools, no organized training, and no plan. When flames spread, panic followed. Some politicians began to recognize the scale of the threat. Cicero, in his writings, makes reference to fires disrupting daily life. Laws were proposed to limit the height of buildings, restrict the use of flammable roofing, and create wider fire breaks between structures. But most of these measures were ignored, unenforced, or quietly repealed under pressure from the powerful landowning class. Rome's legal system, so detailed in matters of inheritance or contracts, was vague and toothless when it came to fire safety. Landlords were rarely held accountable. Tenants were often blamed for carelessness, even if the buildings themselves were built like kindling. And yet, through all of this, the fires kept coming. One of the few notable efforts to address the problem came from Marcus Licinius Crassus, the immensely wealthy politician known as one of the richest men in Roman history. Crassus did not establish a fire brigade out of public spirit. He did it for profit. When a fire broke out in a neighborhood, Crassus would arrive not with help, but with an offer. He would buy the burning property and the surrounding buildings at a fraction of their value. Only once the desperate owner agreed to sell would Crassus dispatch his team of slaves with water and tools to try and put out the flames. In some cases, he simply let the structures burn and rebuilt them as profitable rental housing. His private fire brigade became a business model, not a public service. This form of opportunistic firefighting wasn't unique. In a city without regulation, fire became a tool, a means of intimidation. Even arson was used as a political weapon. Accusations of deliberate fires were thrown at rivals, especially in times of civil unrest. By the end of the Republic, fires were as common as theft. People expected them, feared them, and felt powerless against them. It was an accepted part of city life, an unlucky event to be mourned, not prevented. And yet, some Romans began whispering that this could not go on. Philosophers and civic-minded senators quietly questioned how long a city so flammable could truly endure. Public discussion remained cautious, but discontent simmered. The streets were growing more crowded, the buildings taller and more unstable. Rome's ambitions were imperial, but its infrastructure remained primitive. The water supply was stretched thin. Entire districts had no organized access to clean water, let alone enough to stop a firestorm. The Republic, still clinging to old ways, failed to imagine just how devastating a citywide fire could be. They had no system, no contingency, no leadership prepared to handle the scale of a full disaster. That failure would come to define a turning point, a moment when fire would finally force Rome to confront its own vulnerability. But first, the city would have to burn. Chapter 3: The Great Fire. In the summer of 64 of our era, under the rule of Emperor Nero, Rome burned. It began in the tightly packed wooden stalls near the Circus Maximus, where oils, fabrics, and grain were stored, a perfect storm of fuel waiting for a spark. The fire broke out in the dead of night, when most of the city slept. By morning, it had already become uncontainable. Fanned by dry summer winds, the flames spread quickly through the valley. They raced up the Aventine Hill and leapt across alleyways lined with timber-framed insulae. The blaze moved unpredictably, carried by gusts and collapsing roofs. Fire didn't move in lines. It jumped, scattered, and reappeared in places already thought safe. For 9 continuous days, the city was consumed. 3 of Rome's 14 districts were completely destroyed. 7 more were badly damaged. Temples, libraries, markets, and countless homes were lost. Some neighborhoods vanished entirely. Nothing remained but scorched stone and ash. Survivors recalled the horror with bitter clarity, the choking black smoke, the falling embers, the screams echoing through the streets. Thousands were displaced. Many lost everything. And in the chaos, looting became rampant. With no fire service, no order, and no coordinated evacuation, Rome became a city of terrified refugees. Ancient sources disagree on exactly how the fire started. Tacitus, one of our most reliable historians, admits the true cause was unknown. But rumors spread fast, and one name came up again and again: Nero. According to some, Nero watched the city burn from his palace rooftop, playing the lyre and singing of the fall of Troy. Others claimed he was nowhere near Rome when the fire broke out, returning only when the destruction was well underway. The truth remains uncertain, but the suspicion would follow him for the rest of his reign. What we do know is that Nero acted quickly in the aftermath. He opened the Field of Mars, his own gardens, and even public buildings to shelter the homeless. Food was imported and handed out for free. Emergency relief centers were created across the city. For a brief moment, the emperor appeared as a savior. But it wasn't enough. The people demanded answers. Anger simmered. And in trying to shift the blame, Nero made a decision that would stain his name forever. To divert suspicion, Nero blamed a small and increasingly controversial religious sect, the Christians. At the time, they were still relatively unknown and widely mistrusted. They refused to worship Rome's traditional gods or the emperor, held private gatherings, and spoke of the coming end of the world. To many Romans, they already seemed strange and dangerous. Nero ordered a brutal purge. According to the historian Tacitus, many Christians were arrested, tortured, and executed in horrific ways. Some were torn apart by wild animals in the arena. Others were crucified. And some were burned alive at night, their bodies used as human torches to light Nero's private gardens. Even Tacitus, no friend to Christians, described the punishments as excessive and undeserved. But the public rage was redirected, and Nero's image survived, at least temporarily. In the aftermath of the fire, Nero moved quickly to remake the city. While some saw only destruction, he saw a blank slate. The emperor issued sweeping reforms. He ordered wider streets and set maximum building heights to prevent towering, unstable insula. He banned the use of wooden facades and required stone or brick for new construction. Narrow alleys were replaced with open courtyards. Wells and cisterns were expanded to improve water access. These urban regulations, though met with resistance, marked a turning point in Roman planning. For the first time, the state had enforced rules designed specifically to prevent fire. Builders were now required to follow imperial standards, and landowners could no longer construct as densely or carelessly as before. But Nero's vision wasn't limited to public safety. On land cleared by the fire, he began construction of his most audacious project, the Domus Aurea, or Golden House. This sprawling palace complex covered over 100 hectares. It featured vaulted banquet halls, colonnaded walkways, artificial lakes, frescoed walls, and ceilings coated in gold leaf. One banquet room even rotated, mimicking the movement of the heavens. To many Romans, the palace was an insult. They had lost their homes, their temples, their neighborhoods, and now they looked out over rubble to see Nero building a private paradise. Rumors deepened. Had the fire been an accident, or had it been planned? Nero's response had been decisive, but self-serving. The fire had cleared land he could never have legally claimed. His critics saw the reforms as camouflage for ambition. Yet, despite the suspicion, one undeniable truth remained. Rome had changed. While Nero himself did not create a formal fire brigade, the Great Fire of 64 made its necessity obvious. In the years that followed, emperors would move to fill that gap. The age of improvised bucket lines was ending. The groundwork for a real firefighting force had been laid. The flames of 64 destroyed a third of Rome. But in their wake, the city began to think differently, not just about how to rebuild, but how to endure. Chapter 4. Rome Fights Back. The ashes of the Great Fire were still warm when Rome began to rebuild. But this time, something had changed. The destruction had been too great, the fear too fresh. The empire could no longer rely on tradition alone. Fire, once treated as inevitable, was now seen as something to be stopped. For the first time, architecture, engineering, and legislation came together to fight back against fire. Nero's building reforms were only the beginning. The idea that cities should be built with fire prevention in mind had taken hold. The foundations of urban firefighting, not just emergency response but actual planning, began to form. At the heart of these efforts were the engineers and architects who interpreted the emperor's new mandates. Streets were widened not just for beauty or crowd flow, but to act as firebreaks. Alleys were replaced with courtyards that could contain and isolate blazes. Buildings were no longer allowed to rise unchecked. Height limits were imposed and enforced, at least in the better districts. Construction materials changed dramatically. Builders were ordered to use stone and brick instead of wood. Roofs were to be tiled rather than thatched. Decorative facades of timber, once common in wealthier homes, were banned entirely. Even plastering techniques evolved to include lime coatings that could resist heat better than earlier blends. One key element in this new fire-conscious design was water. Access to water in the dense parts of the city had always been limited. Now, new wells, fountains, and public basins were mandated. Every neighborhood was expected to maintain a source of water for emergencies. Engineers began designing gravity-fed distribution systems that could move water more effectively across uneven ground. Still, Rome had no official firefighting force. What it had were scattered private solutions and a growing sense of urgency. Local associations, collegia, sometimes pooled resources to create informal fire squads. Slaves were trained to respond, often with nothing more than buckets, wet blankets, and sand. The responsibility for these efforts fell mostly on the shoulders of local magistrates and wealthy homeowners. There was no central authority to coordinate a response citywide. That would only come later. But the mindset was changing. The most notable legacy of this transition wasn't a single building or law, but a shift in attitude. For the first time in its long history, Rome was building not just for glory, but for survival. As these reforms took shape, they revealed deeper truths about Roman society. Fire didn't affect all citizens equally. The elite had the resources to implement safety measures. Their domus homes were retrofitted with stone, water tanks, and private guards. But the working poor, still packed into the upper floors of insulae, remained vulnerable. While the new regulations applied citywide, enforcement was uneven. Landowners in poorer districts cut corners, bribed inspectors, or ignored the rules entirely. Builders used substandard materials or built illegally above height limits. Fires continued to break out, especially in the Subura and Transtiberum, two of the city's most crowded quarters. In response, some local administrators began developing informal watch systems. These were not firemen in the modern sense, but night patrols tasked with spotting smoke and raising the alarm. Some were paid, others were volunteers. They carried water skins, horns to alert neighbours, and torches for visibility. If they spotted flames early, a few minutes of warning could mean the difference between evacuation and disaster. Roman legal texts from the later 1st century begin to show new classifications of fire-related negligence. Property owners could now be held liable if their structures contributed to the spread of fire. This was a small but significant shift in Roman law, one that placed responsibility not just on fate or the gods, but on human action. At the same time, Rome's architects began experimenting with compartmentalization, designing buildings with inner courtyards or open atriums that could slow the spread of flames. Public buildings were increasingly constructed with thick stone walls and vaulted ceilings. These designs weren't just grand, they were fire-resistant by nature. One innovation that emerged from this period was the integration of cisterns into building foundations. Rainwater collection had long existed in Rome, but now cisterns were being designed with fire response in mind. Stored water could be drawn up quickly in emergencies. In wealthier districts, some homes even had pipes that could deliver water directly from nearby aqueduct lines, though this was rare. While these changes were slow and not always consistent, they laid the groundwork for something bigger. The city was starting to prepare, not just react. The memory of the Great Fire was still vivid. It shaped policy, design, and even culture. Poets spoke of fire as a lurking enemy. Architects began to measure risk as well as beauty. And Rome's leaders, for all their vanity and ambition, had learned a lesson that would echo into the empire's future. The fire had scarred the city, but it had also sparked its evolution. Chapter 5: The Watchmen of Rome. After the Great Fire, the weaknesses in Rome's emergency response could no longer be ignored. The capital of the empire was too crowded, too combustible, and too disorganized to survive without help. It was no longer enough to widen the streets or build with stone. Rome needed people, trained, equipped, and ready to fight the flames. This transformation began under Augustus, the first emperor of Rome. Unlike the magistrates before him, Augustus understood that long-term stability meant more than armies or triumphs. It required order inside the capital. It required security, planning, and the ability to prevent disaster before it began. In the year 21 before our era, Augustus reorganized the urban landscape. He divided Rome into 14 administrative regions. Inside those regions, he created smaller neighborhoods called vici. Each vicus was responsible for local order and cleanliness, and elected officials were put in charge of street-level concerns. But this system was still mostly civilian. Fires were still fought by neighbors and slaves, not by professionals. The turning point came in the year 6 of our era. Another serious fire tore through the city. Augustus responded with action. He created a new force known as the Vigiles Urbani. They were the watchmen of the city, and they became Rome's first public firefighting service. The Vigiles were organized like soldiers. Augustus started with 7 cohorts, each assigned to specific regions. Each cohort included around 1,000 men. Later, emperors expanded their numbers even further. These men were not drawn from the upper classes. Most were freedmen, former slaves who gained Roman citizenship by agreeing to serve in this demanding role. Their main job was firefighting. At night, they patrolled the streets watching for smoke, sparks, or suspicious activity. They carried water buckets, tools for breaking through walls, and thick blankets soaked in vinegar to smother flames. They also used hand-operated pumps called siphos, which could spray water from large tanks. These pumps were heavy and difficult to use, but they made a difference in the early stages of a fire. Each cohort of Vigiles had its own barracks, watchtowers, and storage facilities. When a fire broke out, the nearest unit would respond immediately. If needed, other cohorts would be sent in from across the city. For the first time, Rome had a centralized response that could act quickly. The Vigiles did more than fight fires. They served as night watchmen. They helped control crowds, stopped petty crime, and kept order in the streets after dark. They also worked alongside Roman aediles, the officials in charge of building inspections and public works. Together, they made sure that buildings followed the new codes established after Nero's fire. The Vigiles were a symbol of Rome's new approach to disaster prevention. Their presence gave citizens a sense of safety. Fires still occurred, but now there were trained men who could respond with urgency. Rome had finally begun to prepare, not just react. But the Vigiles were not perfect. In wealthier neighborhoods, they were often respected. In poorer districts, they were met with suspicion. Some members of the force accepted bribes or ignored fires in areas seen as less important. There were even cases where Vigiles were accused of stealing during the confusion of a blaze. Trust took time to build, and corruption remained a constant problem. To improve performance, the emperors introduced stronger supervision. Officers were given more authority, and strict penalties were imposed for failures. A vigil who abandoned his post during a fire could be punished with fines, lashes, or dismissal from the corps. On the other hand, rewards were offered to those who acted bravely or quickly. The headquarters of the Vigiles was located on the Esquiline Hill in a fortified structure known as the Statio Vigilum. From there, commanders could coordinate all 7 cohorts. The city was divided into zones, and detailed maps and rosters helped track where resources were deployed. This marked the first time in Roman history that civil safety was being managed like a military campaign. The tools of the Vigiles also improved. Leather water buckets were reinforced, fire hooks became standardized. Iron axes were carried for cutting through doors or collapsing unsafe walls. Blankets soaked in water or vinegar were folded and stacked in readiness. Some barracks were even built with raised platforms to keep equipment dry and easy to access. The work was dangerous. Vigiles faced collapsing roofs, blinding smoke, and intense heat. They often had to climb into unstable structures to rescue people or stop the spread of fire. Injuries were common. Deaths were not rare. Despite the risks, the Vigiles became part of daily life in Rome. Children recognized their uniforms. Markets gave them space to move. Citizens knew where the local station was located. When flames appeared, people no longer scattered in panic. They looked to the Vigiles for help. Over time, this force grew stronger and more professional. New recruits were trained, promoted, and paid directly by the state. The shift from chaos to structure had begun. Rome, once a city of ash and fear, had created a way to fight the very thing that had always threatened its survival. The Vigiles were not just watchmen. They were the first line of defense for an empire's beating heart. Chapter 6: Fire and the Roman Law. As fires continued to challenge the safety of Rome, another force began to evolve alongside the Vigiles. That force was Roman law. The legal system of the empire, famous for its influence on modern jurisprudence, was not only concerned with contracts and citizenship. It eventually turned its attention to flame. In the early Republic, legal responsibility for fire was vague. The 12 Tables, Rome's oldest code of law, dating to the 5th century before our era, mentioned fire only briefly. One clause stated that if someone burned a field or a crop by accident, they had to compensate the owner. Another permitted a neighbour to enter another's property in order to remove firewood during a blaze. But these laws were meant for rural disputes, not dense cities. By the imperial period, the urban context had changed. With towering insulae and crowded marketplaces, the potential for destruction had multiplied. The emperors and their jurists began to write new interpretations of legal responsibility. These can be found in later compilations, such as the Digest of Justinian, a 6th century CE summary of Roman law, which includes excerpts from earlier jurists like Ulpian and Paulus. One legal principle began to take hold. If a building caught fire and spread to another property, the owner of the first building could be held liable, but only if negligence was involved. For example, if a fire began from an unattended lamp or a stove left burning too long, the person who allowed it could be charged with culpa, a form of fault. The degree of fault mattered. Accidents were treated lightly. Willful neglect or reckless behavior carried harsher consequences. Roman law also addressed those who hindered firefighting efforts. According to Ulpian, anyone who interfered with the Vigiles, refused to allow access to their water supplies, or blocked passage during a fire could be punished. These provisions show how seriously the empire began to treat civil safety. Fires were no longer seen as random disasters. They were becoming part of legal order. The aediles, officials responsible for public buildings and markets, were tasked with enforcing safety regulations. They inspected shops that used fire, especially bakeries, blacksmiths, and dye works. In markets, rules were established regarding how goods were stored, and flammable materials like oil or pitch had to be kept in sealed containers, away from lamps or open flames. One of the more interesting legal developments was the idea of preventive demolition. If a fire threatened to spread, the Vigiles had the authority to tear down nearby structures to create firebreaks. Roman law protected them from prosecution for damage caused in the course of these actions. The legal term was utilitas publica, the public good. Property rights could be overridden to save lives. To manage disputes that followed these events, courts evaluated claims of loss and compensation. If a building was destroyed by the Vigiles during an emergency, the owner could file a petition for damages, but only if it could be shown that the destruction was unnecessary. Most often, the court sided with the firefighters. The law favoured those who acted to stop the spread. Legal texts also began to define responsibilities for landlords. Owners of insulae were expected to maintain safe living conditions. If structural flaws or overloaded upper stories contributed to a collapse or fire, they could be fined or forced to pay restitution. Some sources suggest that imperial inspectors were appointed in certain regions to evaluate building safety, although evidence is limited. What is clear is that Rome was moving toward a legal framework where accountability mattered. Even tenants had legal obligations. If they brought in hazardous materials, like extra oil lamps or flammable storage jars, and caused a fire, they could be evicted or punished, depending on the damage caused. The law was evolving to reflect a shared responsibility, not just between citizens and their neighbours, but between the state and its people. As the Vigiles expanded their authority, they began to keep written records of fires, responses, and damages. Some inscriptions on stone tablets from later centuries mention fines levied after fire inspections. These may have been posted publicly as warnings. Others reference reforms issued by emperors like Hadrian and Antoninus Pius, who supported continued investment in fire safety. Rome's legal system was never perfect. Corruption and favoritism were common. Wealthy citizens often avoided consequences that poorer citizens could not escape. But the shift in principle was real. Fire was no longer fate. It was a civic issue, a legal issue, and a matter of shared responsibility. The flames that once spread unchecked were now being followed by scrolls, seals, and sentences. In the heart of the empire, law had joined the battle to keep the city from burning. Chapter 7. Tools of the Vigiles. The creation of the Vigiles gave Rome something it had never possessed before, a professional force with the purpose of protecting the city from fire. But organization alone was not enough. What mattered just as much were the tools in their hands and the techniques they used on the ground. The Vigiles used a range of equipment that evolved over time. Their most essential item was the water bucket. These were usually made from leather or woven plant fibers, sometimes lined with pitch to reduce leakage. During a fire, chains of men would pass them hand to hand from cisterns, fountains, or aqueduct outlets to the front lines. While basic, this method was still better than nothing and allowed the Vigiles to act quickly before fires could grow too large. Another core tool was the sipho, a hand-operated water pump. The Roman sipho was adapted from earlier Greek designs and consisted of a large barrel with two pistons that created suction. Water was forced through a hose or nozzle with enough pressure to reach several meters. Though heavy and difficult to transport, these pumps allowed the Vigiles to hit flames at higher elevations, especially in the crowded insulae. Axes were also vital. Roman fire axes resembled short, single-bladed tools designed to break through doors and walls. These were used when fires broke out in upper stories or behind locked shop fronts. Vigiles sometimes had to tear through stone partitions or wooden flooring to reach a blaze or rescue someone trapped inside. Hooks made of iron were used to pull down burning structures or roofs that threatened to collapse. In narrow alleys, fire could jump across the street. By demolishing parts of adjacent buildings, the Vigiles could isolate the flames. This tactic, while destructive, often prevented greater disaster. Roman law allowed them to destroy private property in emergencies, and any damage they caused was considered justified if it served the public good. Thick woolen blankets soaked in water or vinegar were used to smother smaller fires. These were draped over hot embers or flaming thatch. Vinegar may have been chosen for its lower evaporation rate and acidic properties, which could suppress some chemical fires from oils or pitch. Their uniforms were simple but distinct. The Vigiles wore tunics with leather belts, and some carried symbols of office such as bronze badges engraved with their cohort number. In some cases, officers wore crested helmets to distinguish them in the crowd. These small signs helped citizens recognize who was in charge during a crisis. The work of the Vigiles required more than tools. It demanded coordination. Each cohort was stationed in a region of the city and operated from a station house, known as a statio. These buildings were more than sleeping quarters. They included stables for horses, storage rooms for tools, cisterns for water, and sometimes even watchtowers for spotting smoke from a distance. Night patrols rotated on shifts. Vigiles moved in small teams through the alleys and markets, checking for open flames, illegal cooking fires, or smoke coming from windows. When something seemed suspicious, they could raise the alarm using horns or clappers. Larger fires were reported back to the cohort commander, who would then mobilize more men if needed. The importance of time was well understood. A small kitchen fire could be contained in minutes, but if it reached the wooden beams of an upper story or the thatched roof above a bakery, it could bring down a whole insula. Roman firefighting was a race, not a battle. Success depended on speed. Training was essential. New recruits were drilled in basic procedures, such as carrying ladders, forming bucket lines, and safely entering compromised buildings. While little survives of the exact curriculum, we know that the Vigiles held exercises and were reviewed by senior officers. Those who performed well could be promoted to ranks like decurio, who commanded smaller teams, or centurio, who oversaw an entire station. Civic pride was also encouraged. Some inscriptions honor Vigiles who died in the line of duty. Others list names of those who were rewarded for bravery. One surviving relief shows a group of Vigiles holding their tools beside a tall cistern, likely a station plaque meant to commemorate their role in the neighborhood. Despite all this, the Vigiles could not prevent every fire. Equipment broke. Cisterns ran dry. Crowd panic made access difficult, and in the poorest districts, response times were longer. But what they achieved was still remarkable. For centuries, they remained Rome's best defense against a force that respected no wall, no god, and no rank. The tools of the Vigiles may seem primitive by modern standards, but they were the first line of organized defense in a city that had once watched itself burn. With buckets, axes, and courage, they brought structure where there had only been panic. Chapter 8: Water and Fire. Rome's Lifeline. Rome was not only a city of stone and fire, it was also a city of water. For all its glory, the eternal city lived in fear of flame, and it responded to that threat by building a complex network of aqueducts, cisterns, and fountains that carried more than just convenience. In times of fire, water became Rome's lifeline. By the 1st century, 11 aqueducts supplied Rome with hundreds of millions of litres of water every day. They ran for kilometres across the countryside, over valleys and under hills, feeding everything from grand fountains to neighbourhood basins. These marvels of engineering are explored in detail in our documentary on Rome's aqueducts that built an empire. But while they brought water for luxury and cleanliness, they also became essential tools of survival. Each aqueduct emptied into distribution tanks known as castella. These tanks regulated the flow of water into the city and fed the vast network of public fountains. Some fountains were positioned with aesthetics in mind, but many were placed with strategy. They appeared at crossroads, near bakeries, beside tenement housing, and in crowded neighborhoods where the risk of fire was high. The fire brigades, known as the Vigiles, relied on these fountains when disaster struck. Many of their stations were built close to them. Others had their own cisterns connected directly to aqueduct branches. But the system had limits. Because Roman aqueducts used gravity alone, elevation mattered. The Campus Martius and the Forum, being low, had strong flow. Higher ground, like the Aventine Hill, often suffered from low pressure or unreliable supply. In those areas, firefighters had to haul water manually uphill from the nearest working source. There was no way to boost water with pumps. All depended on the careful design of slopes and channels. Our documentary on the waters of Rome explores the spiritual, political, and practical meanings of this infrastructure. But in emergencies, its role was not symbolic, it was tactical. Water determined how long a building could resist the flames and whether a block would survive or collapse. To meet demand, large cisterns were constructed beneath temples, baths, markets, and military posts. These underground chambers, sealed with waterproof mortar, stored both rainwater and aqueduct runoff, and at some fire stations, cisterns lay directly beneath the floors, accessible within seconds. In plazas and courtyards, they were hidden beneath stone lids or bronze grates. Wealthier households could connect to the public water supply with government permission. Using narrow pipes made of terracotta or lead, they brought water into their homes, filling internal tanks or feeding fountains. These homes were better protected during fires, as residents had water on hand before help arrived. Poorer areas, however, shared only a few public fountains. When fires broke out there, water could be far away or already drained. The success of firefighting depended on knowledge of the water layout. The Vigiles studied their districts and memorized the locations of every fountain, cistern, and well. When fires broke out, they moved fast. One team attacked the fire directly. Another formed a chain to draw water. Buckets passed hand to hand. Timing was everything. Larger fires required more than buckets. The sipho, a mobile water pump, was rolled in on wheels and fed by nearby basins. It could project a stream of water high enough to reach the top floors of Rome's insula. But it only worked if water was already waiting. Delay meant collapse. Maintenance of the system was constant. The Curatoris Aquarum, Rome's water commissioners, oversaw the entire flow. They directed repairs, cleared blockages, and coordinated with the Vigiles to ensure that key districts always had working fountains. If pressure fell or pipes cracked, they acted fast. Their job was not only to provide comfort, but to keep the city safe. Laws supported these efforts. Workshops dealing in fire or heat were required to keep water on site. Aediles enforced the rules. Even landlords of apartment buildings were encouraged to install rooftop tanks to collect rainwater. In some areas, public policy made water storage a shared responsibility. During dry months, when supply dropped, the Vigiles were granted emergency powers. They could divert aqueduct flow directly by breaking into a main pipe. This risky maneuver bypassed normal channels and brought water to the front lines. It required permission and skill, but it saved lives. Emperors like Claudius and Trajan invested heavily in this system. They built new fountains in dangerous districts and had inscriptions carved into stone stating how much water each source could provide. These inscriptions still exist. They show that water was not only a tool of luxury, it was part of a public defense system. Still, no system is perfect. Pipes clogged, cisterns leaked, and in the crowded, narrow streets of Rome, fire moved faster than any human could. In poorer neighborhoods, the lack of water access turned small fires into unstoppable infernos. The Vigiles did what they could, but when the water was too far or too slow, they used axes and hooks instead. Sometimes the only way to stop the fire was to destroy the buildings in its path. Yet for its time, Rome's response was unmatched. No other ancient city had built such an extensive water network for public safety. Aqueducts, basins, and fountains formed a silent alliance with the fire brigades. Together, they made water more than a symbol of civilization. They made it a weapon against disaster. Even religion reflected this. Shrines were placed near fountains. Offerings were made to river gods and water spirits. Citizens believed that protecting water meant protecting the city. Water was sacred. To keep it flowing was to preserve life. During key festivals like the Perilia, which honored the founding of Rome, fountains were decorated and cisterns cleaned as part of ritual preparation. Fire and water were treated as twin forces, one threatening destruction, the other offering salvation. It was not unusual for public prayers to mention both in the same breath. When water failed, the Vigiles adapted. They would block alleys with debris to starve flames of air, collapse roofs to create firebreaks, or pull down burning structures with hooks and chains. Their success depended not just on training, but on the city's design, its resources, and the gods who, they believed, watched from the heights of the Capitoline. Rome did not only fight fire with stone, it fought with planning, with faith, and with systems that still endure today beneath its ruins. Chapter 9. Fire, Power, and the People. The fire of the year 64 did not only destroy buildings, it cracked the foundations of public trust in Rome. In the wake of the devastation, the city faced not just scorched walls and collapsed roofs, but something deeper. A sense of betrayal took root among the Roman people, and it would shape how they remembered their leaders for generations. While earlier emperors had used disaster as a moment for civic unity, Nero's actions created the opposite effect. After the flames died, he began construction on the Domus Aurea, a palace so massive and ornate that it drew immediate outrage. This was not speculation. The palace is confirmed through excavation. It spanned wide sections of the city with banquet halls, fountains, pavilions, and carefully designed gardens. The space used to hold shrines, homes, and public facilities. Now it was reserved for imperial luxury. The placement and timing of the palace turned public discomfort into lasting resentment. Ancient writers such as Tacitus and Suetonius documented the public reaction. The decision to build such a private monument during a time of mass suffering was viewed as an insult to Roman values. Nero had not just replaced buildings, he had erased communities. For the first time in Roman history, the urban layout of the capital became a battlefield of symbolism. Nero's Rome was no longer defined by its temples, its law courts, or its triumphal roads. It became defined by its ruler's personal vision, and that vision was built in marble, gold, and silence. The Domus Aurea was not just architecture, it was a message. But it was not the message most Romans wanted to hear. After Nero's death in the year 68, the palace remained, but his memory did not. The next dynasty, under Vespasian and his sons, took clear steps to erase Nero's influence. In one of the most symbolic acts of Roman urban planning, the artificial lake created for the Domus Aurea was drained and filled in. On top of it, Vespasian began construction of the Colosseum. The decision was not random, it was deliberate. Where Nero had built a private world, Vespasian built a public one. The Colosseum, designed for over 50,000 people, became a structure not of retreat, but of gathering. Nero's statue was removed. His gardens were replaced with stone seating. His palace grounds were turned into a space for public spectacle. This shift reshaped the politics of Roman architecture. It proved that stone could serve more than shelter or beauty. It could be used to restore trust. By tearing down what Nero had claimed, the Flavian emperors returned the center of the city to its people. And with that, the legacy of the fire was transformed. It was no longer only remembered for destruction. It became a moment that exposed the limits of unchecked power. It became a line in Roman memory, dividing rulers who led for the public from those who ruled for themselves. The fire had revealed something more dangerous than collapsing buildings. It had revealed an emperor's ambition laid bare. Vespasian, and later his son Titus, understood that rebuilding was not just about bricks and marble. It was about reshaping public feeling. By converting Nero's private estate into an arena that celebrated military conquest and civic pride, they turned architecture into a political tool of unity. Tacitus would later write that Nero's reign had stained the city with shame. But it was the reaction that followed which helped Rome recover. The Colosseum's location was a permanent reminder of what had once stood there. Spectators entering its arches did not walk through neutral space. They walked across reclaimed ground. This reimagining of space extended beyond architecture. It helped re-establish the concept of public duty. Rome's citizens were reminded that emperors were stewards, not owners. The idea that imperial land could be reclaimed, repurposed, and opened to the public was powerful. It set a new precedent for future rulers. The fire's political aftermath also gave future emperors a kind of blueprint. Leaders like Trajan and Hadrian would later invest in civic buildings that bore their names but served the public. Baths, markets, libraries, and basilicas became the acceptable face of imperial presence. Not self-indulgent palaces, but shared monuments that reinforced the emperor's role as provider and protector. In this way, the fire of 64 became something more than a tragedy. It became a catalyst. It demonstrated that catastrophe could either isolate a ruler or bind them to the people. Nero chose isolation. His successors chose unity. The ruins of his legacy served as a warning. The structures that replaced it stood as a promise. Rome would survive Nero. It would survive many more fires. But the lessons left behind by that summer in 64, and by the political theatre that followed, would echo through its walls long after the ashes had settled. Chapter 10. Legacy of Fire: How Rome Endured. Rome was never truly safe from fire. Even after the reforms of Augustus, the creation of the Vigiles, and the rise of concrete and stone, the risk never vanished. But what changed was Rome's response. What had once been panic became policy. What had once been improvisation became organization. The Roman people, hardened by generations of disaster, adapted with discipline. The early city of thatched roofs and timber balconies gave way to a city that could survive. It learned through pain. Fires continued, but the destruction they left behind became smaller. Rarely again did flames consume more than half the city. The reforms implemented by Augustus had lasting impact. The division of the city into 14 regions helped distribute risk. The 7 cohorts of the Vigiles became Rome's first professional fire corps. They weren't just night watchmen with buckets. They had tools, training, and command structures. Some modern fire brigades still echo their methods. Each cohort had a designated district, supply stations, and a chain of command led by an equestrian officer. When disaster struck, Rome no longer stood alone. The architecture itself began to reflect fire wisdom. Homes were increasingly built with tuff and brick. Ceilings used vaulting instead of wooden beams. Mosaic and marble replaced flammable wall hangings. Streets were widened under Augustus and later under Trajan to allow access for responders. Insulae, the Roman apartment buildings, were increasingly regulated. Although corruption and shortcuts still caused collapses, the city's basic structure had changed. Public awareness shifted as well. Romans were not passive observers of their fate. They became more alert, more responsive. The presence of the Vigiles was not just practical but psychological. Their patrols brought a sense of order. Their cisterns and pumps stood ready, built into the neighborhoods they protected. These systems didn't eliminate fire, but they prevented catastrophe. The Roman Forum, once nearly reduced to rubble during repeated blazes, stood rebuilt and reinforced. Basilicas, temples, and porticos were designed not only for beauty but durability. Even public records were eventually stored in fire-resistant buildings. What had been learned the hard way became embedded in law and engineering. As the city expanded, its flameproofing became a defining feature. Rome became the example that others watched. From Londinium to Lutetia, Roman cities across the empire mimicked the structures and strategies of the capital. Aqueduct-fed fountains doubled as emergency water sources. Fire watchmen were deployed in busy districts. Building codes were enforced, though not always obeyed. Yet the most important legacy was not found in a single law or building. It was found in the mindset. Fire was no longer an act of fate alone. It was a challenge to be managed. The legacy of Rome's fire resilience did not end with the empire. It spread outward, carried by soldiers, settlers, and city planners. Across the Roman world, the lessons forged in the capital were replicated in stone, brick, and clay. In North Africa, the city of Carthago, modern-day Tunis, rebuilt under Roman control with wider streets, aqueducts, and stone-insulated forums. Far to the north, in the city of Colonia Agrippina, now known as Cologne in Germany, Roman engineers applied the same principles. Both cities, though separated by thousands of kilometers, became echoes of Rome's strategy for survival. Cities built under Roman influence often featured centralized water systems, urban firebreaks, and zoning that separated workshops from homes. In provinces far from Italy, amphorae stores and granaries were constructed with extra spacing and stone partitions. Even public signage warned of fire hazards in crowded districts. These were not just conveniences. They were proactive designs, survival strategies born from the memory of destruction. After the fall of the Western Empire in the 5th century, much of this knowledge fractured. Cities shrank, infrastructure decayed. Fires once again became tools of ruin, especially during invasions and civil collapse. But fragments of Roman wisdom endured. In Constantinople, the eastern capital, Roman-style firefighting units were maintained. The Emperor Leo III issued new codes regulating urban flammability. Even medieval monasteries preserved certain Roman habits, like stone-built kitchens and water storage within cloisters. Centuries later, during the Renaissance, ancient Roman texts were recovered, studied, and applied to modern cities. Vitruvius, the Roman architect and engineer, became required reading for European builders. Urban reforms in Florence, Paris, and London drew heavily on Roman ideas. The Great Fire of London in 1666, for example, led to new codes and a shift toward brick and tile construction, methods Rome had embraced over 1,000 years earlier. In modern cities, echoes of Roman fire prevention remain visible, even if the connection is not always acknowledged. Fire stations are placed in zones, not unlike the regions of Rome. Hydrant systems mirror the city's cistern and aqueduct setup. Emergency service hierarchies follow a chain of command once used by the Vigiles. Urban zoning laws separating homes from workshops and requiring fire-resistant materials reflect Roman sensibilities adapted to the present. Rome's legacy in fire resilience also shaped something deeper than policy or infrastructure. It shaped the way we respond to crisis. The idea that governments have a duty to prepare for disaster, not only during emergencies but before they occur, originated with the reforms of Augustus. The shift from reaction to prevention was a Roman innovation, and it remains central to public safety today. For all its flaws and failures, Rome built a culture of resilience. It did not always prevent disaster, but it refused to surrender to it. The empire's response to fire became a model not only of how to rebuild, but how to learn. From wood to marble, from buckets to brigades, from fear to foresight, Rome's fight against fire was a story of transformation. In the glow of destruction, it found the will to endure. Even now, buried beneath centuries of stone, the fireproof city remains. Thank you for listening. Rome was many things: a city of triumph, a city of violence, a city of vision, but it was also a city that refused to burn quietly. What rose from the ashes of its fires was more than stone. It was resilience, built brick by brick, law by law. If you've enjoyed this documentary, consider subscribing. Your support is what keeps this channel alive and growing. And if you're interested in how the Romans shaped the world through engineering, explore our 4-part series, From All Roads Lead to Rome, to ancient Rome's aqueducts that built an empire, to Rome's concrete secret and the empire's metal. Each documentary dives into the systems that powered a civilization. You'll find them all on our YouTube page. At History's Edge, we tell history as it truly was. No myths, no shortcuts, just the facts brought to life. See you in the next episode.